consultant with the Midwest Comprehensive Center at the American Institutes for Research, and I am joined by my colleagues here, Sakuni Davis and Mara Shanfield. We also have a handful of Minnesota leadership staff with us today, and they're going to welcome you all in just a few minutes. But before we do that, we just want to set the table for what we're doing today and take care of a couple of housekeeping things. So this is the first in a series of 2 webinars that's going to be addressing selecting evidence-based practices. The first webinar is going to specifically focus on identifying evidence-based practices that meet the minimum requirements for low-performing schools, right? The minimum requirements for Tier 3 and TSI and CSI schools. And then next week, we're going to have a second webinar that goes a little bit more depth on the online resources and a little bit more depth on the actual tiers of evidence. So this first one will really get you going and out there looking for evidence-based practices. And then the second webinar will probably close the loop on a lot of questions that might come up in the process. So the objectives today are to share with you an overview of the tiers, but really focus on the minimum requirements for meeting Tier 3 of evidence. I'm going to provide some visual flags for you, some clues that you'll be able to use to easily and quickly identify some of these minimum requirements around Tier 3. And then we are going to finally expose you to some online resources real quickly so that you can get started using those at a higher level. Just a couple of housekeeping things. You're going to see this evidence tier handouts on your screen as another section of your screen. We're doing this because this is a master list of all the criteria for the evidence, and we're going to be going through the criteria, and so you'll be able to refer back to this as an anchor for the discussion around all the various criteria. Now, just a few notes about the symbols that are used. You'll see that any text in italics during the presentation is going to refer specifically to the criteria. And you see that in the criteria themselves that they're in italics. So the italics text refers to the actual criteria. Another way we refer to the criteria in the presentation is with these circled numerals. So whenever you see a circled number in the upper right-hand corner of a slide, you know that that slide is referring to a specific criteria, and that criteria is going to be indicated by the number in this anchoring table as well. And finally, the final symbol I want to mention is this yellow flag. These are the look-fors, or the visual clues that you can use to find very specific instances of criteria meeting the minimum requirements in research studies. And it'll become obvious how to use those when we get into it, but these are going to be important slides that are going to be look-fors for the evidence criteria. So I'm gonna turn it over to Minnesota real quick, and I'm going to, sorry, I'm trying to get my notes up. I'm going to turn it over to Greg Keith, who's the Director of School Support with Minnesota real quick. He may have a couple of other team members that I'll let him introduce, but he's going to explain the discussion today in the context of the larger school improvement effort at Minnesota.
Hi, David. Can you hear me?
I can. Thanks, Greg.
All right. First of all, David and Midwest Comp Center, thank you for putting together this this PD opportunity for our regional center staff. I think this is going to be really valuable. We did the dry run through it, and so advocates, I think this is really going to provide some good information for you. I have Dennis Duffy here with me. Do you want to say hi, Dennis?
Hello, everyone.
And we just really wanted to give one update/announcement and then just one sort of opening remark before David starts the webinar. Update, Dennis has been working with Sally Reynolds on what might be some good evidence-based practices for credit recovery or dropout recovery schools, or ALCs. We know this has been an ongoing need among center staff. So they are actually going through the What Works Clearinghouse, which David's going to share you some information on that, to identify some evidence-based practices specific to ALCs and even some context around those. So that'll be kind of a follow-up to this webinar. We are also thinking that one of the next steps from these two webinars would be a webinar specific to evidence-based practices to address chronic absenteeism. So we know those are two things that we're hearing from advocates are needs, and so just wanted to update you up front that those are two things that we're working on as next steps from this. Just sort of as a prelude to today's PowerPoint, I wanted to put up our formula for success. Hopefully all of you have seen this and interacted with this at some level. I know Tony has shared this with the centers and that your directors have worked with you on this. Just to kind of put into context that part of the requirements in ESSA, or one of the requirements in ESSA, is that school improvement plans have at least one evidence-based practice that meets one of the top 3 tiers of evidence. And while that's important, and while school improvement plans should have at least that one practice in them, just to remind everyone that we see that as one piece of our larger work. So just want to keep this in perspective, that while this is important, we also value building implementation capacity through the implementation of good school improvement plans and helping schools create that enabling context around continuous improvement. So just want to kind of, as you are watching this and hearing about this and thinking how you're going to integrate this into your schools and into your work with schools, never losing track that this is part of a bigger scope and scale of work that we're hoping to achieve with schools. So with that, David, I'm going to pass it back to you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Greg. All right, to Greg's point, we know that as school improvement advocates, you make a lot of decisions around what improvement activities to select for low-performing schools. And to Greg's point, level of evidence is just one of them, right? This is the hexagon tool that Minnesota has been using for some time, and it lays out 6 criteria for selecting evidence-based practices in general for low-performing schools. And evidence is just one of the criteria. We know that need is perhaps the primary criteria. What does the school need? For example, if a school is looking for, needs a reading curriculum rather, then it needs evidence of a particular reading curriculum that is impactful on outcomes. By that same token, you need to know that your staff has the capacity to implement the reading curriculum. You need to know that you have the supports for the reading curriculum in place before you select a practice, and so on down the line. So this is just to reiterate that it's one of at least 6 different criteria. But we also know that ESSA is really focusing us on this criteria around evidence. This handout that is also available to you demonstrates that there's a number of provisions across Title I, II, and IV that call for evidence-based practices. We're going to let you explore that on your own time, but we know, but the first row is what we're going to focus on here today, right? And that's this requirement that in CSI and TSI schools, at least one practice must meet evidence tiers 1, 2, or 3, right? Not all of the practices in CSI and TSI schools need to meet those tier levels. Just one need to meet tiers 1 to 3. That is the requirement. You guys know the requirement, so we're not going to dive deep on it, but we know that they all share in common that they have to demonstrate statistical significance and show either strong, moderate, or promising evidence that aligns with tiers 1 to 3, and we're going to talk about what that means. But first, the first question you might deal with is, where do you find evidence-based practices? The primary place might be these online clearinghouses. The online clearinghouses are various websites that are starting to pop up now. There's about 10 that compile and evaluate research studies, with What Works Clearinghouse being the primary one. So I just wanted to stop for a moment and ask you a poll question, which is, what clearinghouses have you used on your own already? Mara or Sakoni is going to, there it goes, there's a poll question. Which clearinghouses have you used so far? And if you could just input your answer to that, we can monitor that, and that'll help us as we go along. Could you move that to the side, to the right side of the screen for me? Thank you very much. So other than online clearinghouses, you can look at individual research studies, right? You don't have to find a research study in a clearinghouse to evaluate it for use or not. And one particular type of research study evaluation would be through a single study review that you can actually commission through the Institute of Education Sciences. So if you don't feel comfortable doing it yourself, you can actually talk with Minnesota, or you could actually contact us directly about arranging for the IES to actually do a study review for you. Now, I know there's a fairly, there's some sort of wait to have that done, but it may be worth looking into now before it becomes a real popular tool that people use. And just looking at our poll results, interestingly, about 3/4 of you have already used What Works Clearinghouse. So that's a good sign. So this won't be crazy, but this won't be completely over your head, but hopefully we'll give you a few clues to using it that will really help you dial into what meets the evidence tiers. We see a few people have used Attendance Works, which is great. That's no surprise, since I believe Minnesota provided you guys with that resource. They have a great database of chronic absenteeism-based interventions. And then we also see a few of you have used Evidence for ESSA, which is good to see. One more key point I want to make here, though, is that whether you're talking about a current practice or a practice that is new, these requirements apply. You can't just rely on past experience and say, this is what we've been doing, it's been working in the past, based on my experience, we're going to keep doing it. That does not meet tiers 1 to 3. All right, so let's get into the actual tiers now. So again, this is the master table of criteria around the evidence, and today we're going to be focusing on tier 3. And as you can see here, not all of the criteria apply to tier 3. 5, 6, and 7 are not applicable, so we're really going to focus on these first 4 criteria around research design, group equivalence, statistical significance for the study in question, and then making sure that there's no other studies out there that contradict a research study that has statistical significance, and that's known as no significant unfavorable effect from other studies. We want to provide you this decision tree as well. This will actually help you step through the criteria, and it's an alternative format from the checklist. We'll get into it in more detail in webinar 2, but we just want to let you know it's in the slide deck, and you can use it at your leisure to actually step through these decisions. Now let's focus on criteria 1 and 2, research design and group equivalence. All right, the minimum requirement for tier 3 is that the research design is at least correlational. And that means that the research design at least measures the relationship between practice and outcome. We can see, looking across all of the research designs in tiers 1, 2, and 3, that all of these research designs measure the relationship between practice and outcome. Right? If you just think about that, it's a relatively low bar. But you see that tier 1 and tier 2 build on that to include additional elements of research design that increase the rigor. But the bottom line is that to qualify for at least tier 3 and meet the requirement, you have to at least measure the relationship between a practice and an outcome. So what does that mean? Well, it's very intuitive. Some examples of the relationship between a practice and an outcome are a practice of a dropout prevention program impacting graduation rates, increasing graduation rates. A practice might be instructional adjustments, which have an impact on the outcome of achievement scores, or mentoring programs might impact chronic absence rates. So these are all examples of the relationships, and the key here is that there is a quantitative relationship measured in these studies. So what wouldn't qualify? Well, honestly, because it's a relatively low bar, most of the rigorous research out there at least measures a relationship. But certain types of descriptive research wouldn't, right? Observational studies or qualitative studies which just describe certain things are not necessarily measuring a relationship. Statistics like average and median, those are not describing a relationship between two factors. Those are just descriptive statistics. So what are you looking for when you're looking for a study that measures an outcome and relationship? Well, obviously you can actually just start reading the study and get into it that way and read about the relationship. But one quick look for is to find a table of results and find the practice and the outcome in the table of results. Now remember that these flags mean that these are very specific look-fors to meet the minimum requirements for Tier 3. So that's what we're looking at here. If we find a results table that has a practice and outcome, then you know that you're meeting the minimum eligibility for this specific criteria, which is research design here. So I'm going to cue this up for you guys because it's pretty intuitive. And we're going to unmute the phones and just let you respond out loud real quickly. Looking at this table of results, who can tell me what the practice or practices of interest might be, or what the outcomes might be, looking at the rows and the columns? And one clue to that might be to think about what does not look like a practice or an outcome. In other words, everything in this is not necessarily a practice and an outcome. There are certain things that aren't, but looking at this, what might look like a practice and an outcome? And you can type that into the chat box as well if that is easier for you. I'm okay with awkward silences up to a certain point. So let me say this. Looking at enrollment in Minnesota College in fall 2011 at the top, which is a column header, would that qualify as a practice or outcome? Anybody? I see people typing. I know this is the first time you've seen it. Yes, so we're starting to get some answers here. Outcome is the correct answer. And you can think of that in terms of, well, enrollment in Minnesota colleges is certainly not a practice that might be looked at in terms of the data that's in this results table. It sounds like an outcome that we're looking at. So if the outcome is enrollment in college, what would be something that happens before that could be a practice? Something along the rows, in the rows specifically. What could be a practice? There we go. Yeah, any of these participation rows are going to be practices. Participating. There we go. Got some verbal answers or something going on here. Participation in AP, participation in concurrent, enrollment, etc. Those are all the practices of interest. Without looking at the research study, etc., you can look at this and that makes sense, right? What is the impact of participation in advanced placement coursework on enrollment in Minnesota colleges. That is the practice to outcome relationship here. We see it here. Any of those are practices. We have our outcome at the top. And we see a quantitative relationship that those both refer to and they intersect at. Just a couple other things about research design specifically. What you're going to want to be cautious of is undocumented results. I've made the point a couple of times already that you can't simply rely on past experience. You're going to have to find evidence, documented evidence to actually back up your experiences. Typical program evaluation results are not usually rigorously designed, so those often will not meet the design requirements under ESSA. Qualitative research that does not have a quantitative practice to outcome relationship does not qualify, right? Anything that describes or makes observations without looking at that relationship. And then finally, you're going to want to be cautious of unpublished research or research that's not published in peer-reviewed publications. They often will not meet the rigor. They usually don't, in fact, but again, there's no be-all to end-all rules here, so it's a mere guideline, but you're going to want to be very cautious of those. Let me see. I'm just scanning the chat rooms to make sure I'm not missing anything important right now. And not seeing anything, I'm going to move on to the second criteria. The slides will be made available after the webinar, just to make note of that. But the second criteria is group equivalence. And the minimum criterion for that we see here is that there are statistical controls for selection bias in order to meet Tier 3. So sounds fairly technical. It can be technical in practice, but the look-fors are actually fairly straightforward. First of all, to clarify what this means is these controls are usually referred to race slash ethnicity or other types of student characteristics and school characteristics that are used to ensure that the results of the research are accurate regardless of factors such as race, etc. So in other words, when you see variables in the research such as race or English learner status, etc., you know that the research results hold true regardless of who the student group is, that the results hold true for the English learners and for all students, etc. There's three look-fors I want to point out for those. When you're looking at a research study, there are a few different places you can look in it where you'll see text specifically just talking about controls. You can look in the methodology section. You can look in the literature review. You can look in the introduction. And you're basically looking for language that talks directly about the controls. And you can see some of that language excerpted here. The model's controlled for student and high school characteristics in the first comment balloon there. In the second comment balloon, we controlled for a host of differences, including differences in the characteristics of the population. And then finally, our basic approach is to use a panel of schools to control for observed and unobserved student, family, school, etc. characteristics. So just the mere discussion of controls in a study can often be enough evidence for you to say, okay, we know that it uses statistical controls for bias because it's discussed in the narrative of the study. One other note is that these are also called covariates. Controls are also called covariates. So returning to our results tables, and based on what I've said about controls so far, which of these results look like controls or covariates to you? We're going to unmute you one more time, and people can either chat or say out loud what they think the controls or covariates are. I see people typing. Obviously, webinars are not always ideal for interactivity, but we definitely wanted to make sure we include some for you. And I'm just going to let the typing play out for a second here. We've already pointed out in this results table what the outcomes might be and what the practices might not be. So I'll clarify one thing. If the practices are one type of measure in the results, and the outcomes are another dimension of the results, there's another group of variables that we just talked about that are the controls, otherwise known as covariates. And I'm just going to let you think more deeply about that for a second. And I see more people are typing, so I'm going to let it run for a second. Right, so we're getting some correct answers around that now, that the controls are actually the student characteristics you see here, female, black, Hispanic. And then we also see pointed out that there's also some controls at the bottom of the results tables, right? These two groups of measures are neither practices, are not practices, but they are controls. So in other words, the study is both going to measure the impact of the practices themselves, and they're going to measure the relationship between the outcome and these controls. And by doing so, they will be able to control for bias. But the main takeaway here is that the look for is rather straightforward. You want to look at these results tables, and you want to look for these very specific race, socioeconomic, et cetera, related variables, which are another sign that you've met this particular criteria for Tier 3. The last flag I want to show you is a little more advanced, but I want to just show it to you real quick in case you run across it. Again, you want to look for the presence of these student characteristic or school characteristic variables in the context of statistical equations. So often studies will do what's called a regression analysis. This is a regression analysis equation. And without knowing how to interpret this in general, you can actually look at this and say, oh, okay, I see controls. So again, just based on what we know so far, what would the controls be in this particular statistical equation? All right, I'm seeing typing quicker this time. I think you guys are starting to pick up on the rhythm of this. Exactly. So historically disadvantaged and income in this case are definitely controls. What about received cell though? Maybe that's not quite as obvious, right? Because we do need to still have practices and outcomes in this equation. So in this case, historically disadvantaged and income are indeed the two controls, but you're still going to need some variable for practices. And in this case, you see that receiving social emotional learning is the practice in question, and the outcome is attendance rate. Again, the race-related and race and ethnicity, as well as the historically disadvantaged status controls are the most common probably, certainly not exclusive, but those are the big ones that you're going to want to look for. All right, so now we've covered criteria 1 and 2 look-fors, and we are going to talk about criteria 3 and 4. I should also mention that we're going to circulate a one-sheet that's going to have all these look-fors on it after the presentation, so you'll have them in one nice place. I'll also pause for questions here on criteria 1 and 2, just to make sure that you don't have any other questions before we move forward. Not seeing any questions in the chat box. So I think we're doing okay. All right. Yeah.
David,
Sure.
we had one question, evidence base in the SIP, one evidence base in the SIP or one evidence base in SIP for each area identified?
Yeah, so the clarification is that for any single school, any school that has a CSI or TSI rating, you need literally one and only one practice. It doesn't, for that particular school or district to be implemented. It's not by topic area. There's no other qualifiers around that. You literally just need one evidence-based practice for the CSI or TSI school, and there's no other parameters around that. Does that clarify, or does somebody need a little bit more clarification on that? All right, well, let us know if that doesn't answer your question for you, but I think that's what you're getting at there.
Thanks, David.
Sure. All right, so let's look at criteria 3 and 4 now. And criteria 3, we know that the minimum requirement is that the study is statistically significant. Now we see that all of the tiers have the same exact requirement, right? There's no differentiation across criteria 3 between tiers 1, 2, or 3. Statistical significance is the same for all of them. But let's talk about what that means. So statistical significance means that there's a 95% or higher likelihood that the relationship between a practice and an outcome is not random. Again, if it's statistically significant, if the relationship between the practice and the outcome is statistically significant, there's a 95% chance that the relationship between the practice and the outcome is not random. What do we mean by not random? Well, we mean that it's either predictive, that the practice either predicts the outcome or that it causes the outcome. We also refer to predictiveness as correlating. And one example of what that means might be if you're in a region that suddenly experiences a lot of rain and a lot of people go out and buy raincoats. Let's pretend that the raincoats were not particularly well made and that everybody who buys the raincoat has very itchy skin. We would not say that the rain caused people's skin to itch, right? But we could say that the rain correlates with people's skin itching. That's the difference between predictive and causal. The causal relationship is between the fabric of the raincoat and the skin itching, obviously. So that's the distinction we want to make there. But we know, again, that for tier 3, it can be either predictive or causal, either one. The bottom line is that you need to find the statistical significance. So how do you find the statistical significance? Well, my watchword here is look for the asterisks. But to get into that, let me describe this diagram. Let me describe what we're looking at here for you. Again, we're going to be looking at a results table. This is a results table. You see that we have 2 outcomes for the columns. Outcomes in 3rd grade ELA achievement and outcome in the 3rd grade reading diagnostic tests, right? So 2 different sets of test scores. Then we have 2 practices here. We have a status quo or original curriculum, and then we have a reading 180 practice. So we have 2 practices and 2 outcomes in this. These numbers, where their dimensions intersect, is the actual effect. However, we're not interested in the magnitude of the effect or the impact of the practice on the outcome. In other words, when we're talking about statistical significance, we don't care if this number is 0.91 or 0.78 or 0.71 or 0.90. What we do care about is that the number is positive, right? If this number was negative, that would mean that there is not a positive, i.e. favorable effect of the practice on the outcome. So making sure that that number is positive is your first look for here. Your second look for are the asterisks. The asterisks are really the key to statistical significance. I would say 90% of the studies out there use these asterisks. And what they denote is the p-value. You don't have to have a technical understanding of p-value. What's important to note is that p-values can range anywhere between 0.1 and 0.001. And what you're looking for are p-values that are no greater than 0.05. And you look in the footnotes of the table for that usually. Here you have a p-value of 0.05. You have a p-value of 0.01, which is less than 0.05, and then p-values of 0.001, which are even lesser than that. The lower the p-value, the better. So when you see multiple asterisks, you know that you're increasing in statistical significance. So looking at 0.91, which describes the relationship between the Reading 180 intervention and third grade ELA achievement, we know that there's a positive impact because this number is positive, and we see that there's statistical significance because this asterisk indicates a p-value of 0.05. The 0.05 translates into a likelihood of 95%. So you see that the relationship between p-value and likelihood is essentially inverse. You subtract the p-value from the number 1. So if you have a p-value of 0.05, 1 minus 0.05 is a 95% likelihood that this relationship is not random. You see a p-value of 0.01. 1 minus 0.01 means that there is a 99% chance that this relationship is not random. And finally, this lowest p-value is even more significant. It's a p-value of 0.001. 1 minus 0.001 is 99.9%, right? So there's a 99.9% chance that this relationship here is not random, the relationship between Reading 180 poverty status and third grade reading diagnostic. All right, now I'm going to test your learning on that real quick, and we can spend a little bit of time here just to make sure we get this concept. Here again, we return to the results table, and I'm just going to ask a general question here. What do we know about the statistical significance in terms of the relationship of the practice on the outcomes based on what we just learned? First, find your practice and find your outcomes once again, and then look to find the two aspects of statistical significance that I just talked about. There being both a positive relationship and statistical significance. Look at the footnotes as well. I'll give you a little bit of time. This is arguably the most important look for of all the clues here, because we remember that statistical significance was one common thread throughout all of the tiers. I see people typing. Another way to frame the question is, for what relationships do you see statistical significance in the results table here? What practice and outcome pairing? Multiple attendees are typing. I like to read that. I'm seeing some promising responses here. I'm going to let a couple of other people finish typing here. So I see people saying all, meaning all what? And you could be, here we go. Now we're getting some more specific answers. I think all the answers I've seen so far are correct. I was just looking for a little more specificity. We know what our practices are. All of the rows that begin with participated are our practices, and we see positive magnitudes there indicating a favorable effect, and we also see a high degree of statistical significance for 3 of the rows in particular: participation in concurrent enrollment, in post-secondary enrollment, and then participation in some other unknown program that's not well defined in the study. But you see a high level of significance, meaning a 99.9% chance that the relationship is not random. So requirements aside, that should give you a lot of confidence when you're looking at this research. To know that there's a 99.9% chance that the relationship between a practice and an outcome is meaningful is really to have a lot of confidence in that evidence criteria when you're thinking about which practices to select. Any other questions about statistical significance before we move on? Very important concepts, and you just got the shortest version possible of teaching it, so I am impressed that you guys are picking it up. All right, we're not seeing any other questions, so I'm going to move on here. Again, here's the correct answers, which you've already identified. Our final test for significance is that there's no significant unfavorable effect from other study. All right, so you just went through the process of looking at one study and saying, oh, I'm getting positive statistical significant effects for this study. That's not enough. The next step is to make sure that there aren't other studies out there, sometimes called countervailing studies, that have negative results. A couple of qualifiers, those studies that may override you have to be Tier 1 or Tier 2. So if you find a Tier 3 study that has negative impacts, that does not override the significance of a study you found. Specifically, there has to be a Tier 1 or Tier 2 study that has significant negative effects. So what's the upshot of that? Well, if you're not looking in a clearinghouse, that can be somewhat of a daunting task to make sure that there's no other studies out there that have significant negative effects. And it is, which is why I'm going to show you a shortcut in the What Works Clearinghouse in a second. But in general, the takeaway here is that it's not enough just that your study has statistical significance. You need to be cognizant of what other studies are saying about the impacts. And if there are studies that have a significant negative impact specifically, then that would actually override your results and the study would not be eligible for Tier 3. And I'm going to show you the shortcut for that in a moment. But just to summarize, and I apologize for some of these typos, something got lost in translation when Adobe uploaded our presentation here. Just to summarize, the minimum eligibility for evidence-based practices for CSI and TSI schools are that at least one practice measures a relationship between a practice and an outcome, i.e. is at least correlational, includes statistical controls that account for differences in the participants, and the typical examples are race and socioeconomic status. The study must demonstrate favorable statistical significant effects, and it can't be overridden by negative significant effects from some other Tier 1 or Tier 2 study. All right? I'm going to show you how to find these look-fors in the What Works Clearinghouse in a second, but I just want to pause there for a second to see if there are any questions. We will have time at the end for questions, by the way, if you want to wait. Either way works. All right, I'm going to keep moving on here. Not seeing any questions. All right, finding studies that meet Tier 3. We have a couple astronauts here because we're going to be exploring a couple of resources. Both of these resources are going to be in the What Works Clearinghouse. And we're going to talk real briefly here about the Find What Works database, which I'm sure some of you have used, judging by our earlier poll, and then the Educator Practice Guides, which are another popular resource in the What Works Clearinghouse that you can use. So one important thing to remember is that any practice in the Find What Works database that has a statistically significant favorable effect for an outcome without overriding results qualifies for at least Tier 3. I'll repeat that again. Any practice that meets criteria 3 and 4 qualifies for at least Tier 3. That's because everything that's in the What Works Clearinghouse already meets the minimum requirements for criteria 1 and 2. So in the What Works database, you're going to be looking for some very specific things that can quickly tell you if a practice at least qualifies for Tier 3. So I'm not going to open up the website. Instead, I'm going to show you, I'm going to walk through the screenshots that you'll land on. If you just Google What Works Clearinghouse, and we also provided the link for you on the slide here, this is the landing page that's going to come up for that. And this is the portal for the main database, the Find What Works database. You'll see that the database is arranged by research topic area. Topic areas such as literacy, math, dropout prevention, path to graduation, etc. For our purposes, we're going to dive into the literacy topic area real quick. You know that by selecting literacy here, and just a word, if people could make sure they're on mute here, we're getting a little bit of interference with the audio. We know that by clicking one of these practice areas, you're going to pull up aggregate information on different studies. And the results that it shows you here are sorted by statistical significance. So you're going to see the interventions that have the highest statistical significance at the top of the results that first come up when you dive into a topic area. So you know that starting from the top, you're going to have strong statistical significance. We're going to click down into one of the results here called Leveled Literacy Intervention, which is a specific literacy intervention. And when you select that particular intervention, this is the landing page that is going to be viewed. I'm going to explain the different rows to you here. So you see in the very left column, the left column is called Outcome Domain. And that describes the outcome relationship that is being described. In other words, for the level literacy intervention, that row describes the relationship between the intervention and that specific outcome, which is alphabetics. The next row describes the relationship between the intervention and reading achievement scores specifically. And then finally, the next row describes the relationship between the intervention and reading fluency, which is a different type of measure. So we have three different practice to outcome relationships here. And the key takeaway is that you have to make sure that you're finding statistical significance for the outcome in question. And I'll show you what that means in a second. So the key row for your purposes is this second row that the red box is around. And you see an indicator with you see a band with 6 different indicators on it that looks like this. This is the blown up version. There's 6 different indicators on this little band indicating 2 things. They indicate whether or not statistical significance that is favorable has been found, and they indicate whether there's unfavorable effects from other studies. So just by looking at this one thing, you can determine whether criteria 3 and 4 are both being met. They're aggregating that information into a single indicator for you. The key here is that if any of the first 4 indicators of the band are selected, that the intervention in question is not going to be eligible for ESSA tiers 1 to 3. Because that means either that negative significant effects have been found in all studies or have been found in some studies. Either way, what's important is that they have found some negative effects that override any positive effects. Conversely, if the last 2 indicators in that band are selected, you know that that intervention at least meets tier 3, full stop. So if you find an intervention that has either of these selected, you can be confident that it at least meets Tier 3 and meets the minimum requirements for CSI and TSI. So that's how easy that particular look for is. So then we can apply that to our original screen here. Again, we see 3 practice to outcome relationships, and I'm going to interpret the first row for you, which is that the relationship between this intervention and alphabetics does not meet the criteria for 3 and 4 because I think it looks like the third indicator of the 6 has been selected. On the other hand, looking at the second row, the relationship between the intervention and reading achievement does meet the criteria because that 6th indicator is chosen. Likewise, the relationship between the intervention and reading fluency does meet the significance criteria because that second to last indicator is chosen. So you can see here that the outcome that you're looking to impact is a very important question. It's not enough to simply say, okay, this intervention meets the requirements. When you're looking at this particular resource, you need to know what outcome you're trying to impact. So I just want to check your learning real quickly. And based on what we just talked about, we're going to throw up a quick poll question here. Looking at these different interventions, which of these would meet the criteria for 3 and 4 for statistical significance? And we do have a poll that we're going to throw up here in a second. Just going to slide it over. So go ahead and select all of the answers that apply. Just give it a second for people to respond. Yeah, pretty straightforward. Everybody's responding correctly to this one. I don't see anybody selecting alphabetics. That's how straightforward it is. What Works Clearinghouse really sets you up nicely to at least find interventions that meet the minimum requirements. So likewise, looking at this shared book reading intervention and looking at the results here, which of these interventions would qualify for criteria 3 and 4? We're going to put up another poll question here. It's actually a separate, there we go. If you could respond to this poll question that indicates shared reading. Yeah, there we go. So I see you guys got the gist of it by the end of it. Trick question, none of the above apply because none of these have the interventions to the extreme right, the 2 indicators to the right selected. You got to look closely, and part of it is it's just hard to see, but if you look very closely, you can see that none of these have those specific indicators. So as you can see, that's a very handy tool. Now I want to show you a second type of resource. I'll just pause and see if there's any questions, but it looked like you guys were getting that, so I don't think there's any questions, and I'll keep moving. Great. So the second resource in the What Works Clearinghouse are the Educated Practice Guides, which have been around for a while. These practice guides, again, they aggregate research across multiple research studies. And for these, any practice in a practice guide that has a moderate or strong evidence rating automatically qualifies for at least Tier 3. And unlike the Find What Works database, these do not rely on outcome by outcome relationships. These are broader. When you're looking at the practice guides, you don't have to drill down on outcome as in such detail. Specifically, here are how the different evidence requirements in the practice guides map to the ESSA tier ratings. The only one we care about, again, today is the third. To meet promising evidence, the evidence rating simply has to be strong or moderate. The sample and setting overlap are not applicable, and the version of the handbook that they were evaluated with is not applicable. We'll get into that in the second webinar. What's important here is that strong or moderate evidence is the only thing you need to find to know that a practice is meeting Tier 3. When you do go into the practice guide landing page from the What Works Clearinghouse homepage, which is, you can just go into the menu of the What Works Clearinghouse and you can very easily find these practice guides. You see a set of guides that are PDF files with general topic areas, similar to the landing page of the What Works Clearinghouse, or of the Find What Works database. You see, for example, that the second guide is around preventing dropouts in secondary schools. And if we open that up, we see immediately in the landing page a number of practices with evidence ratings. So here we see 4 different practices described in the Preventing Dropout in Secondary Schools practice guide. We see the first practice is monitor the progress of all students and proactively intervene. The second practice is provide intensive individual support to students who have fallen off track, etc. The third practice is around engaging students by offering curricula and program that connect schoolwork with college and career success, etc. And then finally, you see a practice for at-risk students. So you see some very detailed description of practices. And it's important to note that the evidence is based on you're actually following the practice to the grain size described here. In other words, if you leave out some component of the practice as it's described here in detail, you very well could be not meeting the evidence criteria. So it's important that those are followed closely. But we see obviously that the evidence ratings are noted pretty obviously here. And based on what I just told you, I want to pose one more poll question to you here, which is which of these practices would qualify for meeting Tier 3? And like magic, the poll question comes up. You can select as many as you want. There's often multiple answers to these questions. I know I just showed the information to you for 5 seconds, so you may not be retaining all of this. But some of the original answers to the poll are indeed correct. Again, all you need is to demonstrate moderate or strong evidence to meet the criteria for Tier 3. We see that this leftmost practice here is the only one of these practices that would not meet Tier 3 under ESSA, and that these other 3 practices would. If we could slide the poll to the right, please. And that's it. That is a tour de force of meeting the minimum requirements for Tier 3. Just to summarize, for any given CSI and TSI school, you need to find a study that describes the relationship between an intervention and outcome, either in an online clearinghouse, a separate research study, and sometimes you can have single study reviews done, commissioned through the IES if you don't want to review an individual research study yourself. There's 4 basic criteria you need to make sure are included. You need to make sure that the research design includes controls for bias and that it measures a relationship between a practice and outcome. That's it. Practice and outcome are a relatively low bar, and then we showed you 3 different look-fors around controls for bias. Secondly, we need to make sure that the intervention demonstrates significant favorable effect without any overriding effects, right? You're going to be looking for positive, a positive relationship in results tables, and you're going to be looking for those asterisks to make sure that you see an asterisk that means there's at least a 95% probability. And you're also going to look in What Works Clearinghouse to make sure there's no Tier 1 or Tier 2 studies that override your study that does show significant effects. And I showed you how to look in What Works Clearinghouse for that criteria. The two important shortcuts that I showed you are that any practice inside What Works is going to meet Tier 3 as long as the second two indicators in that band of statistical significance are selected. And in the educated practice guides, any practices are going to at least meet Tier 3 that demonstrate at least a moderate degree of evidence or a strong degree of evidence. So it all boils down for Tier 3 to some pretty straightforward shortcuts, but we will get into this in more depth in Module 2. We're going to show you how to tell the difference between Tier 1 and Tier 2. We're going to talk about why you would care, why research rigor is important. But for now, that's what you need to know for Tier 3. So that does it. We want to open up the phone lines now for questions, and for you can chat your questions as well. The phone would work maybe a little better right now, but that's fine too. And I think you could pose some questions to Minnesota as well right now if you want any further context. And I know my presentation wasn't so good that everything was crystal clear. I see people typing questions, but feel free to say them out loud as well. Additionally, if the Minnesota staff want to provide any further context around anything, feel free to jump in if there was anything Minnesota specific on your mind.
David, I think Dennis and I would just want to add sort of one thing, which is not contradictory to what you said, but just to kind of build on something that you said. Around the question of, do they have to do one evidence-based practice for every area where they might have been identified for comprehensive support and improvement or targeted support and improvement? Just to clarify, schools might be implementing multiple practices, and it is true only one has to have an evidence base. But a couple of sort of building on what you said or clarifying, it would be assumed that in at least one of the areas for which they were identified, that's where, if they're only doing one evidence-based practice, let's say, but we would assume that that one practice they were doing correlates to one or more of the areas where they were identified. For example, they wouldn't be hopefully implementing their only evidence-based practice is math that meets the requirements in ESSA, but they were identified solely for reading. And then which is common sense, but I just wanted to offer that clarification. And then the other thing, just to be crystal clear, we frequently or generally schools are implementing more than one practice. So didn't want anyone to take away that the expectation is schools would only be implementing one thing. They may be doing a couple of different things. We hope that it would be a manageable number of things, but they're not limited to just one practice or strategy. Thanks, David.
Yeah. Yeah, and that again goes to the measure to outcome relationship. That's why it's so important that you're defining the measure to outcome relationship and not just looking at an intervention and saying, oh, I see significant, I know this study has significant effects and so I can use it. You need to make sure it has significant effects for a particular outcome in the case of the Find What Works database. Now the practice guides tend to drill down on outcomes a little bit more specifically already, and that's why there's not as much emphasis on looking at the outcome results, but that's at least partially because those practice guides are already focusing more on particular outcomes than the other types of research. But the point is that relationship has to be for the outcome in question, which absolutely should align with the reasons why the study is, the school is identified for CSI or TSI.
David, did you see Pam's clarifying question? She says only one total, not, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for pointing it out. Yeah, so again, just to clarify, the federal requirement is that just one practice, period. But Greg offered up that context around, the assumption that the relationship between the practice and the outcome addresses the actual reasons for identification. I see another question from Carolyn. We just looked at some attendance pieces in the What Works Clearinghouse practice guide. The first had minimal evidence. Is that first practice like an early warning system such as mirrors? Okay. We're now playing Stump the Presenter. Is there a way to pull that up? Are we able to open that website and share it with the rest of the group? Mara or Sakoni or Yun, whoever has control. Go into the What Works Clearinghouse. Just Google What Works Clearinghouse real quick and open it up if you can. So this is good. We can actually show you how to get into the practice guides real quick. Yeah, there it is. So if you go into the menu at the top, yeah, pull that down, and then at the Find Evidence drill down, a little tricky. Hover over Find Evidence. Yeah, it's tricky. Hover over there you go, and then the Educator Practice Guides is the second choice, and you go into that. And then they were talking about strategies. If you go back to, can we see the question again? Is it possible to see the question again that they put up? I need to see the question to refer to the guide that they're talking about. I'm sorry, I hope I didn't. All right, here we go. Okay. There's some practice guide. I'm not exactly sure which practice guide you're talking about. So can you go back into the website for me? Did it kick us out? It did not. So if memory serves correct, I don't think there's actually a chronic absenteeism practice guide, so you must have found it somewhere else. It may be in, it may be buried in dropout prevention, actually. Yeah, go into dropout prevention for me. While we're doing this, if there are other questions, please queue them up. A couple of things I'll point out real quick is you see here that there's mobile app design or interfaces for these practice guides. So if you want to upload a version that you can easily view on your mobile phone, it has that, so that's good. Yeah, early signs of attendance, intensive support, falling off track. Yeah, so we're actually, go ahead and open that first one. I think this must be what they're talking about, where it says show more. Sorry, it's actually above that. You can backtrack real quick. Whoever's surfing is doing a fantastic job, by the way. Yep, go into that. Learn more about this recommendation. We're going to do this more in detail in the second module so you can really drill down. And instead of saying, we'll answer that in the next webinar, we're just going to do this. If you go ahead and scroll down now. Okay, it's going to take a little bit to open up. All right, whoever asked the question might verbalize at this juncture what they're looking at. But if you continue down, I will make one point of this, which is that they're very specific in the practice guides. Scroll down to like page 10 or something like that. All right, so scroll back up. Introduction. All right, keep going past the introduction. A little bit more.
Hey, David, this is,
yeah.
Can you hear me? This is
Yeah.
John Gimple. So when I originally saw when it said minimal evidence, there was a short description there before we opened up this guide. And that small description kind of sounded like an early warning system. Maybe the question is just simply, is that kind of like our MERS early warning system here in Minnesota? And so maybe the question is, does this guide actually, is it explaining an early warning system, and which we think is evidence-based, or we've been told that it's evidence-based. So maybe that's the question that's happening here.
Yeah. So you're bringing up a great question that we will go into more in the second webinar, which is how close is close enough with some of these practices, right? I'm doing this, and it seems to be close to what they're describing here. Is it close enough? And I will tell you that, honestly, it's one of the harder questions to answer. But key for the practice guides is that it's very specific, and the evidence tends to be based on very specific practices. Now, if they describe a certain type of early warning system, then it's likely that that would apply for multiple early warning systems, assuming that it uses the same measures. I think very quickly you would get lost if the early warning systems didn't actually have the same measures. But beyond that, I don't know that, like a brand of warning system or something would matter that much. But that's actually a really good, I'm glad you asked that, because it's queuing up a real important question that we can go into in the second webinar. Any other questions? Yeah, dropout prevention. Okay. So we're going to do the same thing here next week. Somebody's having problems unmuting. I don't know if we're able to, I don't know if there's a master unmute that somebody can try and switch. But just to give you a preview of next week, I'll go into the Tier 1 and Tier 2 in more detail, and we'll also explore these websites in more detail now that you have a good baseline for Tier 3 and can get started. So come back for that, and I promise you there's a reason that you'll want to know more than just how to meet Tier 3, because the more rigor in the research you have, the more confidence you can have that the research is going to be applicable to your particular school or district. We're just following the chats here. And yeah, we are aware that you guys are writing CIPs this week, which is definitely one reason why we gave you at least some minimum Tier 3 information. And hopefully we've done that. I know people can start dropping off, but if there's anything else that you'd like to know around meeting Tier 3, let me know now. Or we also have our contact information at the end. Otherwise, we'll stay online for just a minute or two to make sure that you guys don't have any other questions. But again, I'd like to thank the Maryland staff for participating, Greg and company, and for my colleagues Mara and Saccone as well, who have been typing away behind the scenes. And as other people jump off, we're going to just talk a little bit more through some of these chats. Oh, I see. So there's a specific question around mirrors. I see. So it's actually, yeah, okay. Right. So, yeah, so so taking your question at face value, if a practice guide said it was minimal, it said mirrors was minimal evidence, and you had proposed that mirrors was your evidence-based practice, then that would not meet the requirement. So that's, again, that's taking your question at face value. I think we need to do a second look here to make sure that there's equivalence between what the practice guide is saying and what you're saying. The other important point for context, again, is that not all practices need to meet the minimal requirement. Just one practice needs to meet the minimal requirement. But this sounds like something that I can actually take a look at after this presentation and get back to somebody via somebody at Maryland, or if this is
Minnesota.
This is Heather and Lori. If my contact information is at the end of this presentation, so if you want to email me directly, I can do that, and I can actually copy the Minnesota staff on it.
That'd be good. This is John again. I think we need to clarify, just because in putting together the mirrors 2.0 that we have, there was a lot of conversation with, I think it was Rel Midwest or AIR. I'm not sure who exactly the organization was, but there was discussion all along the way and talk about how that is meeting the evidence base for ESSA. So that's where we need to clarify that.
Yeah.
That meets it or doesn't meet it.
Yeah, that sounds pretty urgent. So let's do that after this for sure.
Well, I think we're also assuming that what's described in that little paragraph is exactly mirrors. We will definitely double check, but I have Dennis sitting here with me, and Dennis assures me that we do have evidence that the mirror system does meet the evidence-based requirements. So, we're making assumptions that the critical features in our mirror system align with, those 15 words that were in that little box there.
Right. I want to point out, mirrors is based off of early warning systems that have been studied in a variety of, some of them are packaged things like BAR. University of Chicago has done a ton of research around this that look at monitoring those, attendance behavior, course completion, having meetings, intervening around it. So I would need to take a closer look at what is specifically put in the practice guide. But as John mentioned, there was a lot of consultation with AIR and Rel Midwest around, hey, we're putting out this early warning system. What guidance can we put out there that meets this evidence-based requirements? And what we put out, that does meet. So just want to be crystal clear about that.
All right. Well, you heard it there from Minnesota regarding the language that they put out there around that particular practice. I obviously need to get some more context for it, and I can talk to whoever you guys talk to here. Do you know who you talked to who you dealt with at Rel Midwest around here on the point? Who was the point of contact for that?
Mara.
Oh, Mara. Okay. Well, then
But we will definitely send her back and double check and comparison. I think there's also a piece of, there's, anyway, just let us circle back and connect. But we at this point feel comfortable with mirrors being on our list of evidence-based practices for ESSA. So I think that would be our starting point, but we will definitely take another look at that one as we are consistently with other ones.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good lesson, is just to do a deep enough dive on it to make sure everybody's covering their bases. I mean, I will say that this is, you know, I've already mentioned that you guys are the first people receiving this particular training, and this training is coming straight from the What Works Clearinghouse people and other sources of information. So everybody's still triangulating information across each other. So there is going to be some imperfect information out there, I will say. Not to say that you know, I still couldn't make a value judgment on whether, you know, what you're describing meets the tiers or not. But that's just one other contextual fact to keep in mind. But yeah, we're gonna follow up with it right after this and just kind of try and reconcile that. But so we may reach out to you guys and get a little bit more clarification. All right, that about does it for us. I want to thank everybody once again. If there's nothing else, then we will sign off and see you guys next week. And in the least, I think we'll have a response to your question when we come back next week for people who aren't in the loop otherwise. All right. Thanks everybody very much.